Hello, my name is Father Lawrence Jagfeld. I am a Franciscan friar of the Sacred Heart Province, and I am the administrator of CUSA, an apostolate of persons with chronic illness and/or disability. Today we begin at the very beginning. As the song says, a very good place to start. We hear the very first verses of Luke's Gospel. But after we hear those very first verses, we jump from chapter 1 to chapter 4, because we have already read the infancy narrative of Jesus that is contained in chapters 1, 2, and 3. Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you have received. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news of him spread throughout the whole region. He taught in their synagogues and was praised by all. He came to Nazareth, where he had grown up, and went according to his custom, into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He stood up to read, and was handed a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and found the passage where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord." Rolling up the scroll, he handed it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue looked intently at him. He said to them, "Today this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing." Luke tells us at the very beginning of the Gospel that he was not an eyewitness. He has learned of Jesus from others, and he has studied what he has learned. He has investigated it. He has endeavored now to write it down as a narrative. This immediately tells us that Luke's Gospel is going to be different than the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, because Luke is trying to tell a story that is going to record the events of Jesus' life in more or less an orderly fashion. He's doing this for a person named Theophilus. At the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, Luke tells us that he is still writing for Theophilus. So we really have a 2-volume book here that is written for this character called Theophilus. Once Luke has finished telling us what it is he is going to do, we hear how Jesus, after his temptation in the desert, returns to the Galilee, and there he goes to a synagogue where he reads from the prophet Isaiah. Now, those who are very astute at these kinds of things will listen to that prophecy, and they will recognize a poetic convention in it. Jesus tells us that first he was sent to bring good news to the poor. Secondly, he was to proclaim release to those who are captives. Third, he was to proclaim sight to those who were blind. Fourth, freedom for the oppressed. And fifth, he is to proclaim a year of favor to the Lord. If you look at them carefully, you realize that number 1, good news to the poor, is pretty much the same as number 5, proclaiming a year of favor to the Lord. Number 2, release to the captives, is pretty much the same as number 4, freedom to the oppressed. That leaves us with the third one, proclaiming sight to the blind. Now, this poetic convention is called the chiasmus. It is used by writers to focus our attention on the main point. And the way the author does that is by drawing us into it. You will find the main point right in the middle. So the question of sight for the blind seems to be Luke's real focus here. He has cited this from the prophet Isaiah, and as we move through the gospel, we are going to hear over and over and over again that Jesus is going to tell people, if you have eyes, it is best that you see. We will hear incidents of people being cured of blindness. As a matter of fact, the very last sign that Jesus works in Luke's gospel before he enters Jerusalem is to heal the blind man sitting at the roadside outside of Jericho. Sight to the blind is the focus of the gospel, but we're not talking simply about physical sight. We're talking about the eyes of faith. Luke is going to try over the chapters of his narrative to open our eyes to believing in who Jesus is. He's going to show us that Jesus is trying to give us sight. Even though we are capable of seeing, we are to be given the eyes of faith. So as we begin this gospel, it would be good for us to hold this in our memories as the focus for this year in which we will proclaim the Gospel of Luke. Now, unfortunately, because of the vagaries of our calendar, Lent will begin very, very early this year on February 13th. So we will only have a very few Sundays of Luke's Gospel narrative in order before we have to switch to the lectionary for the Lenten Sundays. But we will pick up the thread again after Easter, after we have completed the Easter season, and we will once again work our way through the narrative in an orderly fashion. So if we can, we just need to hold on to the thought that Luke is trying to help us to see and to believe. For more information about CUSA, please visit our website at www.cuson.org.